Greetings and salutations, folks. Story time. When I was a little girl, maybe my first memory was sitting on my mom's bed while she sewed clothing and playing with her fabric scraps and flipping through her art history books. She was an art history major in college, so a lot of art history books. And I would look at all of the pretty women and all of their pretty dresses, and I would, I don't know, dream about frolicking through a field and being a princess or something. It's like 3, give me a break. Around this same time, I also had a maybe slightly uncomfortable for a 3-year-old obsession with the talking fox version of Robin Hood. Anyway, there was one dress in one book that I was convinced was the dress that Robin Hood should have worn. I begged my mom to make it for me, and bless her, she tried and tried. I think she probably made me like 5 or 6 versions of this absurdly intricate dress. It never quite worked out. Years later, I inherited my mom's art history book collection, and I looked, but I just could not find this dress. Then I was Pinterest surfing and I came across this dress. It's by Madeleine Vionnet, and it's the dress. Madeleine Vionnet is often credited with inventing bias cutting, which is just stupid because bias cutting and draping has been around since basically we invented cloth. But Madeleine Vionnet did push the tailoring of bias cut garments and perhaps helped shape the slinky bodycon silhouette of the 1930s. But Vionnet had a marvelous career full of innovation and beauty long before the bias-filled 1930s. This garment in particular is from 1920, which is a kind of neither here nor there era of fashion history, well past World War I and any lasting vestiges of Edwardian fashion, but we are not quite at the height of the 1920s with its flappers and speakeasies just yet. Totally serendipitously, my husband got me this book for my birthday. This is the dress. This book, by the way, is just amazing. It contains a lot of really great information on Madeleine Vionnet and her amazing early 20th century designs, including patterns, or diagrams. These diagrams are an awesome gesture for how something was made, but fairly vague, not the easiest thing to follow. So it's a long shot to use this diagram as an actual pattern, but I have to try. This dress, is a perfect example of this in-between time. It features the corsetless, loose silhouette of the 1920s with a slightly more natural waistline common in the 1910s. But of course it's the harlequin pattern that steals the show. This is achieved via the carefully calculated mathematical precision of Vionnet. The diamonds come together in a perfect way to create a tube that is slightly narrower at the top than the bottom. In case you missed my not so subtle language, the key here is precision. So let's make this absurdly intricate dress using this absurdly vague diagram. I began by using Adobe Illustrator, aka Modern Witchery, to turn the tiny diagram into a full-scale pattern with the top and bottom diamond points hitting me where I thought they should hit, judging by the tiny illustration in the book. I also numbered each of the individual diamonds. There are 158 of them, in case anyone was wondering. I always see people seemingly proudly talking about sewing patterns with a ludicrous number of pattern pieces. Well, I win, I guess? I think that the best way to do this is to treat this like bands that are just going to come together. What I mean by that is that I will cut out each of these squares individually, and then I will sew them into a band, and then I will sew the individual bands together. I think that that's the most orderly way of doing this. If you look at this pattern, nothing is straight here. It's, you know, all of the bands are kind of, like, they're not a straight line. And so it's not like I could really construct this like a grid. It kind of just has to be done like bands. In the diagram, they've broken it down into a front panel and a back panel. And I think that that is done for a reason. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm basically going to construct the front and the back separately, and then I will connect them. Believe it or not, I thought that I was going to literally cut every single one of these out to make a toile and, like, you know, carefully put them together to make sure that everything was all perfect and all of that. Instead, I cut it out as one big piece, just like this big pattern piece, and then the back, and then I sewed them together and made the tube. And I'm just going to make sure that the tube fits. This is the toile, by the way, not just a random sheet that I've thrown up here. I've actually made like these little samples here just to kind of test out how all of these diamonds are going to actually like come together. I cut apart the pattern into the individual diamond pieces. These had no seam allowance. I added that to the actual fabric pieces before cutting. Okay, now the grand question that's been plaguing me since I decided to make this dress, the fabric. I'm sure all the sewers out there will agree. All fabric decisions can really be simplified into a Venn diagram of wants/availability/budget. Naturally, I wanted a luscious deep green silk velvet, and they are available, but for far more than I'm able to spend. If you watched my dyeing video a few weeks back, you know that somehow my Venn diagram ended up with me dyeing a bunch of old t-shirts green. Not sure how that math worked out. Anywho, you can see my full dyeing escapades in the other video. This video will commence with me and a pile of green t-shirts. I cut off the sleeves and all the inner seams to create panels of fabric. I traced each diamond onto the wrong side of the jersey, meaning I made this in reverse. There were some vague grain line references on the diagram here and there. I followed those as well as I could. Mostly I made sure that the pieces' grain lines made sense with each other to avoid bubbling. I added a 1/4 inch seam allowance directly to the fabric. I actually thought about hand stitching these for a hot minute. So glad I sewed them by machine. Trust me, even if you love watching hand sewing, there's a lot of it. Also, a PSA, since jersey stretches, it's appropriate to sew it using a stretchy stitch, like a zigzag or a serged seam. I didn't actually need/want mine to stretch, so I sewed it with a plain straight stitch, which will be extremely reinforced by the end, so I wasn't concerned about the seams stretching and breaking. The diagrams in the book remind me of the technical challenges in Bake Off. Like, there's this ridiculously difficult dish, and the instructions are, make the dish. The actual instructions so far for this particular dress read, join the rectangle pieces, which will result in a tube, the dress silhouette, then open all seams and overcast. Again, the inside edges of the bands could be serged to finish them, but I think it's important with this effect that the seam allowance be held down to the back. So I went in and hand fell stitched each side of the seam allowance to hold the seam open. I did not fold the fabric to enclose the raw edge. Jersey doesn't really fray, and I didn't want the bulk/stiffness of a fold, especially in all of the seam intersections. I then sewed each band together, being extremely careful to match every diamond seam. I fell stitched the long inner band seams. Now enjoy a nice montage of what took me approximately 28 years. Constructing one band at a time did really help to break things up a bit. I saved all of my fabric waste, and I have a couple of ideas for how to use it in the near future. Once I had the back and front panel, I attached the underarm gussets. I then matched up the front and back panels' zigzagged joints, one zig/zag at a time. This seems like a good point to re-emphasize that this project really does require exact precision. I'm a fairly precise sewer, but even my seams were a bit off here or there, so there were a couple of unaligned joints. I felled all of these seam allowances to the back as well. The tube was constructed at this point, and I hand-finished the zigzag edge of the neckline and bottom with a small rolled hem. Part of the second instruction on the list is to couch gold metallic thread over all seams on face side. I have a feeling that's done for a couple of reasons. Number one, I mean, you know, it's pretty. Number two, it kind of re-emphasizes that medieval romanticness of the whole thing. But most importantly, because velvet has a pile, you run the risk of kind of losing some of the elaborate seam work in the pile. So putting that gold cord over everything kind of ensures that you get credit for all of the seam work that's in there. This brings us to major dilemma number 2. This is a close-up of the fabric of the original, and it's gorgeous. I love the way that the gold cord kind of just nestles into the velvet. It doesn't really look like a trim at all. It almost just looks like part of the textile. They've also done this in alternating pile facings, so that also helps to, make the harlequin pattern stand out a little bit. I'd actually thought about doing jersey and reverse jersey for mine, but that just didn't seem like it would have the same effect. Jersey does not have a pile, so a gold cord cannot really nestle into jersey at all. I tried it out regardless, and it kind of just looks like the trim is sitting on top of the jersey, which is not the effect that I want. I tried out probably every single bead that I have in my inventory right now, and nothing is really standing out as a good option for me. Plus, there's a lot of seaming here. So I did the calculations, and I think it's like 150 something inches that have to be couched, so that's a lot of work. I did find one option that I thought was an interesting parallel to the gold cord, which was to use strings of green crystals. It's very subtle, but it kind of gives like this nice little sparkly sheen to the whole thing. Plus there's actually another version of this dress where they use crystals instead of gold cord to kind of emphasize the lines, and I really like the effect. However, I did the math, and I think that all of the crystals that I would need to go over all of the seams and the hems is around $250, which seems weird for a dress that's made out of old t-shirts. I mean, unless you're like doing it in, like a subversive way, but I'm not, so. Ironically, this is something that used to happen all the time when I worked in the fashion industry. You would develop a really cool trim, only to find out that it totally destroyed your cost sheet. There are a couple of different ways that you could go about fixing that. Obviously, you could source a cheaper trim, or you could use the trim in less places. Not really an option for me because I'm not liking any of the other trims. Or you could do what I like to do, which was combine the two trims, like combine the cheaper version with the more expensive version to get something kind of in the middle, which is really neither here nor there for this particular project because I don't like that version either, and it's still too expensive. I do actually have a trim that I used to use a lot when I was in the industry, which is like a ball chain. It's really fun to knit with. I was in the knitwear department, so I used to knit with it quite a bit, ironically, when all of my trims failed me. So that's an option. I actually really like that as an option because it kind of mimics the gold cord a little bit, but it's like a less formal version of it. I mean, t-shirts, it makes sense, right? So yeah, let's give that a try. To say it is difficult to sew a round metal trim to a small seam is, well, it's true. I found the fastest way was to hold the trim to the seam and use my domestic machine to zigzag over it very slowly. This did not result in straight or accurate trim placement. The round beads really wanted to roll to the side of the seam. So I ended up unpicking nearly all of it and couching it down ball by hand. This means I went over every single seam of this thing by hand in some way 3 times. I then used a blanket stitch to secure each ball of the trim individually to the edges of the neckline and bottom hem. If you watched the macrame video, surprise, this is where I used the belt. And I also made a 30-inch strip for the neck. I dyed both of these in the same way that I dyed the body fabric. Referencing back to the diagram, I attached the neck points to their corresponding neck strip points by hand. I 1000% have a much better understanding of Vionnet and her design philosophy after making this dress. The construction is the embellishment, and sure, all of the seam work is a lot, but it's also got a calm sophistication, almost simplicity to it. There is the romance of historicism, but the construction pushes the conversation forward. I absolutely reserve the right to revisit this gown and make a more true to Vionnet version in the future. If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to relax for a bit and see some simple, pretty sewing videos, hit subscribe because I have a couple of those planned before my next big project. Bye!